Imagine a country that is, often stereotyped in the media.
Right.
Like stereotyped as struggling or volatile or, quite frankly, just kind of left behind. You have probably seen the headlines.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone has.
Right. But now, I want you to imagine that exact same country hitting number 17 in the entire world for gender development parity.
Wow.
And that was in 2020, number 17. Beating out these highly developed, massively wealthy economic powerhouses. We are looking at El Salvador today.
Which is just a wild statistic when you really think about it.
It really is. But here's the catch, right? They're pulling off these hyper-specific wins on a fraction of the budget of the nations they're actually beating. And the question is how?
What's fascinating here is how El Salvador forces us to look in the mirror and completely redefine what development actually means.
Yeah.
Because we are so conditioned, especially in the global north, to think of progress as just a straight line of GDP growth. A rising stock market, higher median incomes, endless consumption.
Right. The classic definition of a successful country.
Exactly. But when you look at the raw data, it reveals development as this incredibly complex, fragile web. It is a mix of health spans, educational stock, and environmental survival that doesn't always track perfectly with how much money is sitting in the national treasury.
And for you listening right now, that is the exact paradox we are unpacking today on this deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
We have our hands on a massive, line-by-line global development data set. And this covers everything from 1990 all the way up to 2023.
It's a huge amount of data.
It really is. And our mission is to understand how a country achieves world-class equity in certain areas while remaining anchored by extreme, undeniable income challenges.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin measuring a paradox like this?
Well, you have to start with the baseline. I mean, if you were going to measure human progress over a 30-year span, you need a reliable ruler.
Right.
And the primary ruler that the global community uses is the HDI, the Human Development Index.
Right, the HDI, which basically strips away the noise and looks at 3 non-negotiable pillars of a decent life, right?
Yes, exactly 3.
So you've got health, which is measured by life expectancy at birth. Then education, measured by a mix of expected schooling for kids and actual schooling for adults. And finally, income, which is measured by gross national income per capita.
Exactly. It is the foundational metric. And if we look at El Salvador's core HDI, we see this massive chronological race from 1990 to 2023.
Okay, lay the numbers on us.
So back in 1990, El Salvador's HDI sat at a modest 0.523.
Which is pretty low, right? I mean, compared to the rest of the world at that time.
It is. To give you some context, the global average in 1990 was about 0.60.
Okay.
So El Salvador was starting roughly 13% behind the global baseline. They were starting the race with a distinct disadvantage, largely due to, historical conflicts and economic instability in the region back then.
Okay, let's unpack this. Fast forward to 2023. El Salvador's HDI has climbed to 0.678.
Yes.
That is a nearly 30% cumulative increase over 3 decades. But, and here is the kicker, the global average also climbed, reaching 0.756.
Right. The whole world is moving forward.
Exactly. So El Salvador is still trailing the global average. Are they actually catching up or just sort of treading water?
Well, if we plot these two numbers on a chart, El Salvador's growth versus the world's growth, something remarkable emerges. The slopes of the two lines are virtually identical.
Wait, explain how that works. If the slopes are identical, they aren't catching up. They're just staying exactly as far behind as they started.
Think of it like a drafting effect in cycling, or maybe 2 runners on a track. The global average is running in the middle lane. El Salvador is running on the inner track.
Okay, I can picture that.
El Salvador started the race in 1990, a few paces behind. And for 30 straight years, they have been running. They are always in that lower lane, always seemingly behind the global average runner.
Right.
But if you look at their speed, their cadence, the rate at which their legs are pumping, it is a perfect mirror of the global average. Their growth curve is locked in synchronized step with the rest of the world.
So even though they have less than half the financial resources of the countries pulling that global average up, their velocity of progress is exactly the same.
Yes.
That doesn't make intuitive sense. I mean, how do you buy the same speed with half the money?
It suggests this concept of synchronized global development. It implies that certain development milestones like basic vaccinations, primary education rollout, public health messaging, these have become democratized global technologies.
Oh, I see, like the blueprints are free now.
Exactly. A country doesn't need to be overwhelmingly rich to access the methods of progress anymore. El Salvador is proving that if you adopt the global playbook for basic human survival and education, you'll experience global-level growth rates.
Even if your national wallet is relatively empty.
Exactly.
And we see this synchronization even when things go completely wrong. Like,
Yeah.
look at the data for 2020 and 2021.
The pandemic.
Yeah, both the global average and El Salvador hit the exact same pandemic pothole. The world HDI dropped, and El Salvador's HDI dropped too, falling back to 0.660 in 2020. They hit the exact same bump at the exact same time.
Precisely. The mirror effect holds during booms and it holds during global shocks. But to really understand the mechanics of this, like how they are keeping pace, we have to pull apart that HDI score and look at the first pillar.
Which is health, the great equalizer.
Yes. Let's look at the actual life expectancy at birth. In 1990, a child born in El Salvador could expect to live to be 61.9 years old.
A relatively short life by modern standards, right?
Very much so. The global average in 1990 was already at 65.1 years.
Okay, now jump to 2023. El Salvador's life expectancy at birth is 72.9 years.
It's an incredible leap.
It really is. That is a gain of more than an entire decade of human life in just 33 years.
Over 10 added years. And look at how fast they are moving compared to the world. The global average went from 65.1 years to 73.3 years over that same period.
So a gain of about 8.2 years globally.
Right, but El Salvador gained over 10. They are rapidly closing the absolute health gap. They are now just a little over a year behind the global average.
But how? Like, let me push back here. If we establish that their national income is drastically lower than the global average, how are they buying an extra decade of life?
That's a great question.
You can't just wish away mortality, you know. It requires real infrastructure.
It requires a shift from treating disease to preventing it. You don't buy an extra decade of life across a whole population with expensive MRI machines and multi-million-dollar surgical centers.
Right.
You buy it with clean water initiatives. You buy it with widespread, robust vaccination campaigns that eradicate childhood mortality from things like measles and rotavirus.
Basics.
The basics, yeah. You buy it with maternal health education. This is what we mean by democratized survival. When a developing nation focuses its limited budget on community health workers and basic sanitation, the return on investment in human years is astronomical.
And the societal impact of those 10 extra years must be massive. I mean, for you listening, we're not just talking about a number on a spreadsheet here. 10 extra years fundamentally rewrites the social fabric of a community. Think about it. A whole generation of grandparents who back in 1990 might have passed away before their grandchildren even started primary school. Now they're living long enough to see those grandchildren graduate from high school.
It changes the entire economic structure of the family unit. You have the transfer of generational wisdom, yes, but more importantly, you have elder childcare support within families.
Oh, wow. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah. That frees up younger parents to work. You have a massive extension of active labor participation. People in their 60s are still contributing to the informal economy.
But the data also shows the fragility of this specific kind of progress. Let's talk about that COVID anomaly we mentioned earlier.
Right, the pothole.
In 2019, right before the world stopped, El Salvador had pushed its life expectancy to 71.7 years. By 2021, the data shows a devastating plummet down to 69.9 years.
It's brutal.
They lost nearly 2 years of life expectancy almost overnight.
This is a critical observation, and it highlights the underlying vulnerability of developing healthcare systems to global acute shocks.
Because they don't have a safety net.
Exactly. When a system is optimizing every single dollar just to maintain basic preventative progress, like we just discussed, with vaccines and clean water, there is very little buffer. There is almost no slack in the system to absorb a massive wave of critical care needs.
Right, because ICUs cost a fortune.
Precisely. Developed nations took a hit, yes, but developing nations often saw their baseline health infrastructure buckle under the sheer weight of a novel virus because they simply didn't have the intensive care capacity.
It reminds us why health is the absolute foundational pillar. You can't benefit from a highly funded education system, and you certainly can't participate in a high-income labor market if you aren't living long enough to enjoy them.
That's the reality.
But if we assume they've mostly secured that baseline of survival, we have to look at what they're actually doing with those extra years. And that brings us to the second pillar, where things get significantly more complicated. Education.
This is where we see one of the most fascinating structural tensions in the entire data set.
Yeah. When we look at the 2023 data for El Salvador, we see a stark, undeniable contrast. We have two metrics here. First, expected years of schooling, or EYS.
Right.
This is what a child entering the school system today is projected to receive. For El Salvador, the EYS is 11.1 years.
That is a very solid number. I mean, it signifies a societal commitment to getting children through primary and most of secondary education. It means the infrastructure is there to keep kids in classrooms until their late teens.
But then we look at the second metric, mean years of schooling, or MYS. This is the actual average number of years of education received by people ages 25 and older.
The existing adult population.
Right. El Salvador's MYS is a mere 7.3 years.
And for context, the global average MYS is 8.7 years. So El Salvador is significantly trailing the world in the educational stock of its current workforce.
So we have a nearly 4-year gap between what the kids are getting and what the adults have. It's like, okay, here's where it gets really interesting. It's like a massive software update.
I love this analogy.
Imagine El Salvador is a computer network. The new hardware, the kids entering the system today, they're receiving the 11.1-year update. They're being programmed for a more complex, service-oriented digital economy. But the legacy systems, the millions of adults currently driving the economy, paying the taxes, running the businesses, they are stuck on version 7.3.
That analogy perfectly captures the friction, because what does a 7.3-year average actually mean on the ground?
Like middle school, basically.
Right. It means basic literacy and numeracy. It means you can read a manual, you can do basic arithmetic, but it does not mean you have the advanced STEM skills, the digital fluency, or the critical problem-solving training required to build a high-tech, high-wage economy.
And this creates an intense generational tug-of-war. How will this gap shift the political and economic landscape in the next decade? You're going to have a highly educated youth cohort entering a workforce managed by an older generation that might not have the same technical or academic background.
It's going to cause immense friction. The youth will demand jobs that match their 11-year education. They want to be software developers, advanced manufacturers, global service providers.
Sure.
But the economy, built and managed by the 7-year education cohort, might only be generating lower-skill, lower-wage jobs in agriculture, basic assembly, or informal retail.
Which brings us crashing into the third pillar.
Yeah.
The harsh reality check of global development.
Income.
Ah, yes.
Let's lay out the 2023 data. The global average gross national income per capita adjusted for purchasing power, so we are comparing apples to apples, is $20,327.
Okay.
El Salvador sits at $10,595.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, El Salvador is attempting to survive and thrive on roughly 52% of the global average income, barely over half.
This lack of capital is the anchor that drags down their overall HDI rank to 138th globally.
When you look at their health numbers, they don't look like the 138th country in the world. When you look at their youth education expected years, they don't look like 138. But the wallet is incredibly thin. So I have to ask, how do they do it?
It's the ultimate question.
How do you keep the progress train moving when the engine is only getting half the fuel of everyone else?
This really highlights the inefficiency and, frankly, the danger of judging a nation's success purely by GDP or GNI. If you only looked at the $10,595 figure, you would assume a failing health system and a collapsed educational infrastructure.
Right.
Yet El Salvador manages to keep health and education steadily rising.
Right, but what is the actual mechanism? Are they just incredibly frugal?
It requires extreme allocation efficiency at the state level, yes, prioritizing public clinics over luxury infrastructure. But the real hidden engine is social capital and the informal economy.
Interesting.
Official GNI often fails to capture the intricate informal safety nets that keep a society functioning. Family structures pool resources. Neighbors provide unpaid childcare.
Oh, and remittances, right?
Huge. We cannot ignore remittances. Money sent home from Salvadorans living abroad forms a massive direct-to-consumer welfare system that bypasses official corporate wage metrics but directly funds local food security and education.
Okay, so we've set the baseline. We see the health successes, the education bottleneck, and the income anchor. Now we turn to the absolute most surprising part of this data set, the hook we mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive.
The gender parity paradox.
Exactly. This is where the data completely shatters the stereotype.
To understand this, we have to introduce a new lens. The GDI, or Gender Development Index. It measures the exact same HDI pillars: health, education, and income, but it compares the female score to the male score to see if progress is equitable.
Right, so a GDI score of 1.0 means perfect parity between men and women in those basic development areas. The global average in 2023 is 0.955, El Salvador's GDI is a staggering 0.938.
They are incredibly close to the global average.
And to remind you listening of our opening statistic, this isn't just a recent fluke. In 2020, El Salvador's GDI literally placed them 17th in the world for gender development parity. 17th out of nearly 200 countries. It's mind-blowing. And when you look at the subdata, you see why. Let's look at life expectancy again. In 2023, Salvadoran women drastically outlive men.
Yes, the gap is huge.
Women are hitting an impressive 76.3 years of life expectancy. Men are dying at 67.5 years. That is an almost 9-year gap.
We see a similar trend globally, women generally outliving men, but the gap in El Salvador is exceptionally pronounced. And if you look at the education data, the expected years of schooling for females is 11.1 years, exactly the same as males. Basic human development achievements, living a long life, going to school, are being accessed by women at equal or greater rates than men.
Wait, let me stop you right there. Are we saying El Salvador is a utopian society for gender equality hidden in Central America?
Yeah.
Are we completely misunderstanding the region? Because, frankly, that contradicts a lot of reporting on violence and structural issues in the area.
You are absolutely right to be skeptical, and this is exactly why the UN developed a harsher cousin to the GDI, the GII, or Gender Inequality Index. It serves as a necessary, sobering reality check.
Okay, what's the difference?
The GDI measures achievements in basic capabilities like, can you read and will you live to be 70? The GII measures opportunity, empowerment, and safety. And here, the utopian illusion rapidly fades.
Let's unpack that GII data. Because while a woman in El Salvador might live to be 76 and go to school for 11 years, her actual lived experience regarding safety and power is drastically unequal.
Right.
The maternal mortality ratio is 42.8 deaths per 100,000 live births. The adolescent birth rate is 54.2 per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19. That's a huge number of young girls having children instead of finishing that 11-year education pipeline.
It is. And look at political empowerment. Only 27.4% of parliamentary seats are held by women. So the structural policies dictating the future of the country, the laws regarding healthcare and economy, are still overwhelmingly drafted by men.
But the most glaring pain point, the statistic that practically jumps off the page, is the labor chasm.
Yes.
Female labor force participation is just 48.8%. Less than half of women are in the formal labor market. Compare that to male participation, which sits at a robust 78.1%. That is a near 30% gap.
This is the critical failure point in translating basic development into true equality. You have a female population that is healthier, outliving men by a decade, and receiving the same expected years of schooling. Yet almost a third of them are locked out of the economic engine of the country.
So why does that happen? If they have the education and the health, what is literally stopping them from working?
It comes down to the care economy and cultural norms. When a state lacks comprehensive subsidized childcare or elder care, that burden inevitably falls on women.
Yep.
A woman might have her 11 years of schooling, but if she is expected to care for aging parents who, as we noted, are living much longer now or raise multiple children without structural support, she cannot enter the formal 9-to-5 labor market. She is forced into unpaid domestic labor or precarious informal work.
So you have the capability to thrive, but the society denies you the opportunity.
Yeah.
It means a country is building immense human capital in its women and then essentially leaving it sitting idle.
Exactly. It's an incredible economic inefficiency. You are funding the education and health of half your population, but not allowing them to generate formal economic returns.
Which brings up a larger question about how resources are shared across the board. We've talked about the gender divide, but what about the wealth divide?
Also a huge factor.
Given the income anchor we discussed, the $10,595 per capita, you might expect El Salvador to have massive, brutal inequality, like a few incredibly rich families and everyone else in pure destitution.
To measure that, we bring in another atmospheric layer of our data, the IHDI, the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index. This metric actively penalizes a country for hoarding its development among the elite. If a billionaire walks into a crowded room of broke people, the average income in that room skyrockets, but nobody actually got any richer except the billionaire. The IHDI corrects for that exact illusion.
And what does the data show?
I will admit, looking at the data, I felt genuine surprise here. When you apply the inequality penalty to the global average HDI, the world suffers a development loss of 21.96%.
Over a fifth.
Right. The global average loses over a fifth of its progress because it's hoarded by the top.
Wait, Are you telling me El Salvador's penalty is lower than the global average?
It is. El Salvador's loss is only 18.14%.
So despite having a much smaller pie of overall wealth and resources, El Salvador actually distributes its basic development achievements more equitably across its population than the global average.
Yes.
They are sharing the little they have better than rich countries are sharing their abundance. How is that even possible?
To really see the mechanics of this, let's look at the three faces of inequality based on the 2023 radar chart data. The researchers break the inequality penalty down into health, education, and income. First, look at health inequality. It is incredibly low at just 8.867%.
That is amazing. It means that regardless of where you are born in the country or your social class, your chances of living to roughly 72 years old are remarkably consistent. They have effectively democratized survival.
But then you look at the other two faces. Education inequality sits at 21.29%, and income inequality is at 23.33%. These are the major sources of internal friction.
So if I understand this correctly, you'll live just as long as your rich neighbor, but your neighbor's going to go to school significantly longer and make vastly more money.
Precisely. El Salvador has democratized survival, but they have yet to democratize prosperity. The health baseline is secure vaccines and clean water are distributed fairly well, but the ladders of upward mobility, access to university education, capital accumulation, business loans, these are still tightly clustered and unequal.
And as we talk about survival and long-term prosperity, we have to talk about the physical survival of the country itself. This brings us to the newest and arguably most crucial lens in our data set.
The PHDI.
Right, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI.
This metric changes the entire paradigm of our conversation. For a century, we define a developed country as one that builds massive factories, drives millions of cars, consumes endless consumer goods, and burns mountains of coal and oil to do it.
The industrial model.
Right. The PHDI says, wait a minute, your high standard of living is melting the ice caps, destroying the biosphere, and borrowing from future generations. We are going to deduct points for that.
And when you factor in ecological costs, the entire global ranking gets turned upside down. The global average HDI drops significantly when adjusted for planetary pressures. But El Salvador actually jumps up 9 places in the global rankings.
It's a huge leap.
They rank 138th in regular HDI, but they rise to 103rd in PHDI. Let's look at the exact footprint data to understand why. The global average carbon footprint is 4.54 tons of CO2 per capita. El Salvador is sitting at a mere 1.29 tons.
Less than a third of the global average.
In the material footprint, the actual physical resources extracted to support the lifestyle of an average citizen, from mining to agriculture. The global average is 12.71 tons per person. El Salvador is at 9.1 tons.
Which is significantly lower.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Are we really giving them a green medal for this? Isn't their footprint only low because half the population simply can't afford a car or a massive air-conditioned house? Is this green advantage an intentional forward-thinking eco-policy, or is it merely a side effect of lower industrialization and poverty?
This raises an important question, and it's a highly debated point. Realistically, it is primarily the latter. A $10,000 per capita income simply doesn't buy you 2 SUVs per driveway, central air conditioning in every room, and weekly fast fashion deliveries. Their carbon footprint is low, largely because their consumption is low.
Right, that's not environmentalism, that's just basic economics.
True, but it forces us to ask a profound question about the global north. Can the so-called developed nations truly call themselves developed if their success comes at the literal cost of the planet's habitability?
That's a fair point.
If the American or European model requires 15 tons of material and 10 tons of carbon per person, it is mathematically impossible for the whole world to develop that way. The biosphere would collapse.
So even if El Salvador is green by default rather than green by design, their data is strangely pioneering. They are achieving a life expectancy of 72 years and expected schooling of 11 years, while only emitting 1.29 tons of carbon.
Yes.
They are proving that basic human dignity and longevity do not inherently require destroying the biosphere.
Exactly. It's a low-impact model of human survival. It proves that the correlation between carbon emissions and human well-being decouples after a certain point. You need some emissions to build a hospital and pave a road, but you don't need endless emissions to keep people healthy.
It's a fascinating reframe. But let's bring it back down to the ground level. We've spent a lot of time in the macro 30-year view, looking at these massive national averages.
Yeah.
I want to zoom in for a micro snapshot to understand what the friction looks like on a daily basis.
Let's do it.
We are looking at the 2014 Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI, data.
The MPI is vital because poverty is not just a lack of cash. If you hand a person $100, but they have no local clinic, no school for their kids, and no clean water, they are still living in deep structural poverty. The MPI measures the overlapping deprivations a person faces at the exact same time.
And when we break down what actually causes poverty in El Salvador, the data is incredibly revealing. You'd think, based on the low GNI we obsessed over earlier, that income deprivation would be the sole driver.
Right.
But look at the actual weights of deprivation. The #1 driver of multidimensional poverty, a lack of schooling years, accounting for 26.4% of the poverty weight.
Followed closely by low school attendance, which drives 16.9% of the poverty, and poor nutrition at 13.3%.
Think of multidimensional poverty like a Jenga tower. The low-income ambition, the lack of cash is just one block near the top. It's visible, it's obvious. But if you just pull out the income block, say, through a temporary cash transfer or a short-term job, the tower of poverty doesn't necessarily topple.
No, the structure's still there.
It's firmly held in place by the foundational blocks, lack of education and poor nutrition. Combined, lacking years of schooling and poor attendance make up over 43% of the structural weight keeping families trapped in poverty.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, it completely validates our earlier discussion about the mean years of schooling being stuck at 7.3 years.
The software update problem.
Exactly. That historical deficit isn't just a macroeconomic bottleneck, it is the literal micro-mechanism keeping individual families trapped in a cycle of poverty. You cannot dismantle the poverty tower without pulling out those educational blocks.
Which brings us to our final synthesis. Let's look at El Salvador's 2023 global report card across the board and see where this migration of rankings leaves them.
It paints a picture of a nation living in multiple centuries at once. In GDI, the basic gender parity metric, they rank a highly respectable 74th. In the GAI, measuring the harder inequalities of labor and safety, they drop to 96th.
And then the green index.
Right. In PHDI, they are 103rd. And in the traditional HDI, dragged down heavily by income, they sit at 138th.
If we synthesize this entire massive data set, 3 core findings emerge. #1, steady ascent. Despite historical conflict, despite poverty, despite global pandemics, El Salvador is moving robustly from a medium human development tier toward a higher one, perfectly matching the pace of the world.
#2, the parity pioneer. Their gender development parity remains their shining, unexpected triumph. They are a global model for ensuring basic health and educational access is distributed equally between boys and girls, even with highly constrained state funds.
And #3, environmental efficiency. They are achieving this progress with a uniquely low carbon and material footprint, challenging the assumption that development requires ecological destruction.
But the data is flashing warning signs. The single biggest stumbling block is that near 30% gender labor gap. You cannot achieve true high-tier human development while leaving half your population's economic potential untapped.
Right.
And secondly, that legacy educational deficit.
Exactly. Well, to you listening, thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense, data-rich journey into the numbers behind the nation. We hope peering into El Salvador's data has challenged some of your assumptions about what development looks like and how progress is actually built.
And as we look to the future, the data leaves us with a fascinating unresolved tension. We've spent a century defining a successful country as one that generates the most capital, regardless of the carbon burned or the inequalities forged. Looking at El Salvador's data, where people are living longer, greener lives with high gender development parity on a fraction of the budget, you have to wonder,
Wonder what?
are they behind the curve, or are they quietly modeling a low-consumption, high-equity future that the rest of the developed world is going to be forced to adopt?
A brilliant question to leave on. Remember, the numbers never tell just one story. They tell the story you are willing to look for. Keep questioning the data, keep looking beneath the surface, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.